Hello, Ed. All right.
Hello. It's a pleasure to
So,
be with you.
all right. Well, let's get started here. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site. My name is Spencer Morgan. I'm the executive director here. I'm so glad that you came out to enjoy what turned out to be a beautiful but cold day here in Buffalo. As naturally, it is a week of St. Patrick's Day, which is why we're having this event tonight. We are joined here by Ed F. O'Keefe, the author of The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President. This is an impactful week for us. For those who are familiar with Theodore Roosevelt's history, I find every day here at the TR site, we're constantly straddling this line between celebrating a president and memorializing the president before him. I mean, obviously, we talk about the assassination of President McKinley and why Roosevelt became president here in Buffalo. The same goes for Valentine's Day. For those who know your Roosevelt history, and I'm sure Ed will talk a great deal, Valentine's Day is not a happy day for Theodore Roosevelt as a man, as a husband, as a son, and went through a great deal of suffering. So today it's an event that we are going with an open heart and an open mind, but we know the difficulties behind these loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Ed. We are happy to have our in-person visitors with us tonight. Ed is, of course, remote and will be joining us live. For those in the audience, we will have some cookies and refreshments after, so I hope you came hungry. Happy Valentine's Day. And for those on Zoom, if you have questions and answers, please feel free to pop your questions into the chat box, and our lovely assistant, Pat, will read them aloud. For those in person, I'll bring the mic over to you. Feel free to ask your questions, and Ed will hopefully have an answer for you. And if not, I think maybe the introduction of a new book. I just wanted to take a moment too to recognize Pat Zarpa, who is here virtually with us. Pat is a member of our staff here at the TR site. Pat is our programming assistant. She puts these programs on for us and really organizes them. But Pat, you're not in Buffalo tonight, are you?
No, that's here.
She might be frozen. That's okay. We'll get back to Pat later. So Pat is actually out west. She is volunteering with the National Park Service for 3 months and is still working with us part-time remotely. So just a standard that we like to set about volunteerism, exceptional leadership, and what it is to be civically engaged. So I just want to commend Pat and thank her for all she's doing for our country, even though she is out west and enjoying such lovely weather. But she is here in spirit. So thank you, Pat, for everything you do. It is now my pleasure to introduce your speaker for the evening. Edward F. O'Keefe is the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. He previously spent 2 decades in broadcast and digital media on ABC News, CNN, Now This, and during which time he received a Primetime Emmy Award for his work with Anthony Bourdain, 2 Webby Awards, and a George Foster Peabody Award for ABC's coverage of 9/11. He also received the Edward R. Murrow Award. He's a former fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School, and he graduated with honors from Georgetown University. He was born in North Dakota, but he lives here in New York State, that is, with his wife, his daughter, and his son. And with that, Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, Spencer. It is an honor to be with you tonight. I wish I could be there in person. And Pat, Spencer said it best, but thank you for your service and for the invitation to make this presentation this evening. I will note that Buffalo is my family's favorite spring break location. In 2021, when we were still under the auspices of the pandemic, we drove up to Buffalo and stayed at the Westin, and a robot delivered my family's food. And ever since then, if you ask my 8-year-old son to this day where his favorite place to spend spring break, he will say Buffalo, New York. So very happy to be with you again. Sorry we couldn't come be with you in person. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully the presentation comes up. Let me know if it does. And then let's see if we can get it into full screen here. And if it does, you should be able to see the Roosevelt family. Are you able to see
Yes.
the Roosevelt family? Okay, good deal. So the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that the most masculine president in the American memory is actually the product of unsung and extraordinary women. And it all begins with this family. Martha Bullock Roosevelt, Theodore's mother, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., his father, whom we're going to hear more about in a moment, and their four children. Anna Roosevelt Cowles, who was known as Bammy, his older sister, of course, the most famous of the Roosevelt children, Theodore Roosevelt, Elliott Roosevelt, his brother, who was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Corrine Roosevelt Robinson, who was his younger sister. And again, we're going to hear more about some of these characters in a moment. And I just want to make sure that we see Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt. Do you now see Martha?
Oh,
No.
Do not. Okay, no, this would be full screen MIDI. Let me go ahead and stop the share and I'm going to try it again. Sometimes this happens when we go full screen on the share. So I'm going to escape from that. And hold on just one moment. 1 sec, please. Okay, here we go. We're not going to be able to go full screen, but you'll be able to see them and we'll be able to share. So now do you see? Now you
Yes.
see Martha. Okay, great. I'm going to make that as big as I can. So you see her? Excellent. Okay. So Mitty Bullock Roosevelt is TR's mother, as mentioned, and of course, Eleanor's grandmother. She, believe it or not, was the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. She was born in Connecticut, but was actually raised for most of her life in Georgia. And Bullock Hall, which is today a historic site in Georgia. Mitty was witty and sharp-tongued. She had these incredibly coy turns of phrase. It's actually Mitty who introduces her family and TR in particular to a series known as the McGuffey Readers. And the McGuffey Readers have these sayings like the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. She's the one who will homeschool the Roosevelt children along with her sister, Anna, because she lost contact with two of her brothers during the Civil War. So dastardly were her brothers' deeds for the Confederacy that they were among the few who were denied the general amnesty by the United States at the conclusion of the Civil War. And we can talk about those brothers if you'd like a little bit in the Q&A. Her mother and her sister actually moved from Georgia to join the Roosevelt family at 28 East 20th Street here in Manhattan. That today is also a National Historic Site in the National Park Service. So if you think about it, Theodore grew up in a veritable retinue of women. He had not only his mother, but his grandmother and his aunt living with him. And of course, most of the housemaids and servants were also women, in addition to many of his tutors. Mitty had 4 children in 6 years, and she was widowed relatively young in her life. And after the death of Thea, which we'll talk about more in a moment, she had this remarkable phrase that she instilled in her family to live for the living and not for the dead. She had this resilience, this will to continue after an emotional trauma. So you think about 2 of the things we most identify with Theodore Roosevelt. One, this ebullient personality, this big, larger than life presence and personality, and his ability to will through physical pain. Those are 2 things that he really got from his mother. Now, perhaps like most couples, she was the diametric opposite of her husband. In fact, her brother-in-law said of their relationship, between Mitty's liveliness and your solemnity, you make an even match. So let's hear a little bit about TR's childhood. I think most people who are familiar with Theodore Roosevelt's story know that he began life as an asthmatic, sickly child. He was prone to taxidermy and natural science. He lived his life through his imagination and through books. And he was an odd child. He was a curious kind of child. And his mother, Mitty, really understood this. She knew that he needed friends, and she looked within the neighborhood for those friends and found young Edie Carreau, who was about 3 years younger than Theodore and almost exactly the same age as his younger sister, Connie. So enmeshed in the Roosevelt's life did Edie become that they actually referred to her as a bonus sister. She was always around, and Mitty invited Edie to be homeschooled with the Roosevelt children. Remarkably, TD and Edie will know each other practically their whole lives, and grow up together in that 28 East 20th Street homeschool environment. And again, Theodore Roosevelt was not the masculine Mount Rushmore that we think of today, especially as a child. The first words of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt are, "From the beginning, the survival of Theodore Roosevelt was very much in doubt." And it was often Mitty who identified that he needed friends, who would see when he was having an asthmatic attack that she needed to massage his chest until the blood came out. Theodore had these recurring nightmares as a child that the devil, which was asthma, was coming in the middle of the night to take him away. And so he has this formative moment in his adolescence, around 12 or 13 years old, where his father says to him, "You have the mind, but you must make your body. Without the body, your mind will not be able to go as far as it can." And he rejects his mother. He rejects the fact that she was taking him to spas and really coddling him, because she feared, like most of his doctors did, that he might not live through childhood. And he begins to make his body, and then only 8 years later, his father will die, which we'll hear more about in just a moment. So I've switched now the slide to Theodore "Thee" Roosevelt Sr. He is, of course, Theodore's father and Eleanor's grandfather. And as mentioned before, he is the diametric opposite of Mitty. Where she is lively and vivacious and inviting with a big personality, he's known as a stern disciplinarian. He's a devout Christian, and not just any type of Christianity. It's a particular type that's growing in popularity during the Victorian age, known as muscular Christianity. You actually begin to see depictions of Jesus during this period as larger, as beefier and more muscular. And he believes in this precept, the Christian notion that to whom much is given, much is required. He is a partner at Roosevelt and Sons, the family business, which we can talk a bit more about if there's interest. But he's really focused on philanthropy. He's one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History. The charter for that remarkable institution that continues to this day in New York was actually signed in the parlor of the Roosevelt family home. He's a co-founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He founds the first orthopedic hospital in the United States here in New York City. And he's a big supporter of the orphanages for the newsboys here in New York and elsewhere. He did not serve in the Civil War because Mitty feared that Thee would meet her brothers on the field of battle. And so he, like many wealthy Americans of the age, actually hired a substitute. But unlike most Americans, he did get involved in the war effort, working directly with President Lincoln, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And as mentioned previously, Thee unexpectedly died at the age of 46 years old. Theodore was only 20 and in college at the time. It absolutely devastated him. Whatever position his father, who had just 8 years earlier challenged him to make his body, whatever position he held of exaltation in his eyes, really went to a stratospheric level, and really, in a way, diminished the record of Mitty amongst historians, because Thee was seen as such an important part of his life and deserving in many ways. So in the research for the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I made several new discoveries, including the discovery of 11 letters that had been in the possession of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, which of course is a good friend of the TR inaugural, since 1954. They had not been seen, they had not been shared, and they had been not been known to exist until Greg Wynn, the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, uncovered them. And fortunately, during the research for the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I was able to see them and write about them for the first time. Among those 11 letters is a remarkable letter from December 31st, 1861, which of course is the first year of the Civil War. And this is a letter written from Thee to a 3-year-old Theodore Roosevelt Jr., his son. Harvard actually called these letters one of the most important sets of TR's correspondence to surface since his death in 1919. And this one, as you can see on the screen, features a picture of Jackson's statue, Andrew Jackson's statue, that to this day is in Lafayette Square behind the White House. And it says, "Dear T.D., I have just come from a meeting with the president who governs our whole country. And there is a statue that sits outside of his home. And I want for your mother to read what it says and for you to learn it by heart so that when I get home, you can repeat it to me." And the statue says, "The Federal Union, it must be preserved." So it's a really remarkable discovery in that here you have Thee, who has just come from a meeting with President Lincoln, and he's writing to the future president who will idolize Lincoln about his meeting at the White House, not yet known as the White House, because of course that's the nickname that the Roosevelts will give it in the 1900s. At that time, it was known as the Executive Mansion. So TR's college years, I want to fast forward a little bit out of his childhood to a really consequential year of 1878. I mentioned before that Thee dies of stomach cancer on February 9th, 1878. So this is Theodore Roosevelt's second year at college. When he goes home from college after the death of his father, he's expected to marry Edith, that little girl that we met a while ago. She's grown up with the Roosevelts, and she's just turned 17. And on her 17th birthday, Theodore and Edith go for a row out in Oyster Bay. They pick water lilies, and they ascend a point known as Tranquility in Oyster Bay. And everyone believes this is the moment that Theodore Roosevelt will propose. But on August 22nd of 1878, something explosive happens between them. Instead of getting engaged, they break up. And this match is now thought to be over forever. And in the space of just a few months, Theodore has lost his father to cancer, and he's lost the woman that he expected to marry. And then remarkably, when he returns to Harvard in the fall, on October 18th, 1878, just 2 months after the breakup with Edith, he meets Alice Hathaway Lee. And suddenly, it's Edith who? Beautiful, beguiling, perhaps the most eligible Boston Brahmin bachelorette in all of the land. She's from this extraordinary Cabot Lee family, if you know the old Boston toast. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. She's a Cabot. She is way out of his league. Remember, again, Theodore Roosevelt is a geeky naturalist in whose wake formaldehyde lingers. He has taxidermy in various states of decay in his pockets. He's known for shouting across the Harvard yard in an uncouth manner of the day. So the idea that Theodore Roosevelt would pursue and win the most eligible bachelorette is pretty absurd. Now, Alice has been written off in history as a privileged Victorian, typical of the age and inconsequential in her relationship to Theodore. I found something entirely different. There were 24 love letters between Theodore and Alice that had not been available to many prior historians. They were not available, for instance, to Edmund Morris when he wrote his trilogy about TR, beginning with the rise of Theodore Roosevelt that documents their relationship. These letters were not available to David McCullough when he wrote his extraordinary Mornings on Horseback. They've only come to light in the last 25 years or so, And they really do shed a totally different tell a totally different picture of their relationship. I found in these letters a gamine or playful Alice, curious, intelligent, sexy. She really reminds me more of a Audrey or Kate Hepburn or a combination of the two. And again, she comes from this progressive, reform-minded family. Theodore has lost his father. He's lost his girlfriend that everyone thought he was going to propose to and get engaged. And then he meets Alice and the Saltonstalls and the Lees and the Cabots, and they're talking about reform. They're talking about equal rights and suffrage. So influenced is Theodore Roosevelt by this presence and by this family that he actually writes his Harvard senior thesis on equal rights for women. He endorses suffrage in 1880, 40 years before the 19th Amendment. He says that women should be doctors and lawyers and judges. He says that women should own property and that they should not necessarily take their husband's name upon marriage. These are radical ideas, all informed by the relationship with Alice. And she really steered Theodore more toward politics than science, which of course was a major change in what he thought he was going to do with his life. And so lively, engaging, athletic was Alice that her nickname was actually Sunshine. So when you're dating in the 1870s, the way that you prove it is you go get a tintype, a photograph. And in these letters, it's quite fun to watch Theodore ask again and again of Alice, shall we go get that tintype? Is it time to have our tintype? And repeatedly, Alice puts him off and forestalls the official recognition of their relationship. And finally, when he gets her to agree to get a tintype, she brings her cousin. So you can see here in one of the photos on the screen, Cousin Rose is positioned between Alice and Theodore. And boy, Theodore looks really happy about it. But he is Theodore Roosevelt. He's persistent. He's persuasive. Somehow he convinces Alice to take another photograph. And there you can see in the second photograph, Theodore is now seated. Rose doesn't look too happy about this turn of events. And Theodore is ever so slightly, look at that hand. It's just about touching Alice's elbow. Scandalous for the age. And indeed, he led a 2-year pursuit of Alice. And here is Alice with Theodore's sisters, Connie in the middle, the younger sister, Bammy, the older sister, on the other side of Connie. And it really took the Roosevelt family, in addition to Mitty, to win over Alice. Theodore spent 2 years, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern dollars. He had trinkets and gifts. He got a horse and put the horse in a stable at Cambridge. He would travel by horse the 12 miles round trip to Chestnut Hill. When he lamed the horse, he got a dog cart. When he broke the dog cart, he walked. It's a remarkable record of his relentless pursuit of Alice, but he needed his sisters and his mother to come to Cambridge and Chestnut Hill, where he threw a party and began to win them over, and then invited the Lee family to New York. And it's my contention in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that Alice fell in love with, as much as she fell in love with Theodore, she fell in love with this remarkable family, and in particular, his sisters and his mother, and the idea of being a part of the Roosevelts. So they had an intense relationship. And again, not available to McCullough, not available to Morris. Some of these letters are pretty extraordinary. This is just a selection of two. Theodore writes to Alice on October 3rd, 1880. This is just 3 weeks before their wedding. They were engaged on Valentine's Day of 1880. So a significant date we'll talk about more in a moment. But here is TR to Alice. He says, "It will be the last separation from my darling. For 3 weeks from Wednesday, we are married. It makes me so happy. I am almost afraid." And then Alice replies 3 days later to Theodore, "My own dearest Teddy." And of course, if you know your history, Alice was the only person besides his close family and very close friends who was really ever permitted to call him Teddy. It was Alice's nickname for Theodore, Teddy. And then after she died, he didn't want anyone to call him Teddy again. He reluctantly embraced the nickname in popular political culture because, of course, he knew not to fight it, but he didn't have anybody close to him in his life that would call him Teddy again, except for Alice. So my own dearest Teddy, I just long to be with you all the time and never separate from you, even for 3 weeks. Teddykins, probably the only other person to call him Teddykins too. Teddykins, I know you can make me happy, and you must never think it would have been better for me if we had never met. Again, remember, she's a Lee. She's out of his league. He thinks he's not worthy of her. I should die without you now, Teddy, and there is not another man I could have loved in this world. Well, of course, that takes us to the fateful events of February 14th, 1884, which Spencer referenced in the introduction. In just a few days, we'll celebrate or memorialize this terrible day in Theodore Roosevelt's life. They were engaged on February 14th, 1880. 4 years later, Alice is pregnant with their first child. So convinced is Theodore that the child will be born on the date of their anniversary, Valentine's Day, that he returns to Albany to work as a state assemblyman. And in Albany, he gets a telegram indicating that a baby girl, has been born on February 12th, 2 days before he expected it. The next day, he gets a second telegram, and the contents of that telegram have been lost to history. We only know Theodore's reaction to the telegram. His face went ashen white, and he ran from the New York State Assembly to the train station in Albany. He took an agonizing 5.5 hour train trip, which normally would have taken 2 to 2.5 hours, but because of this thick, dense fog that had descended over the city, it took twice as long. And when he finally arrived in New York, he could not get a hansom cab. The fog was too thick to do so. He had to walk the 16 blocks to 6 West 57th Street, where his brother had said, "There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too." He rushed up to the 3rd floor and he held Alice in his arms until 2:30 in the morning, when he was called down to the 2nd floor of 6 West 57th Street. The family, his brother and sisters, had gathered around his mother, and she died of typhoid fever at 2:30 in the morning. He ran back up to the 3rd floor and he held Alice in his arms for an additional 11 hours, when at 1:30 in the afternoon, she too died of Bright's disease, a kidney disorder that was exacerbated by childbirth just 2 days earlier. He wrote famously an X in his diary: "The light has gone out of my life." And remember what he said. What was her nickname? Sunshine. He's meaning quite metaphorically, the light of my life, my sunshine, Alice, is gone. So another bit of folklore, if you're familiar with the story of Theodore Roosevelt, is that from that moment on, he expunged Alice's memory and never spoke of her again. I discuss and hopefully prove in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that is simply not true. And there's one bit of new physical evidence discovered at Sagamore Hill that I think is quite persuasive. So as I was doing the research at Sagamore Hill, I said, Alice died at 22 and disappears from the earth. There's hardly a record of her except for these 24 love letters. I would love to see anything you have. And there was a record of a piece of hair that a mother might keep or a father might keep of their child, of Alice at 9 months old. I said, I know it's unusual. I'd like to see it. We got the record out for the first time in probably 70 years or so, and it was a teal, almost green, Tiffany-like box. And indeed, when we opened the box, there was inside the hair of Alice at 9 months old, like a mother would keep, a small ringlet of hair. But then we noticed there was a compartment underneath, and underneath there were several photos of Alice, and then this: 16 inches of Alice's hair with a note in the very distinctive handwriting of Theodore Roosevelt: "The hair of my sweet wife Alice, cut after death." This was hidden for decades at Sagamore Hill, revealed for the first time in the loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore kept a keepsake of Alice, his favorite photos of her, as well as the hair that he cut after her death and the hair from her youth, and he hid it from Edith and everyone in his family for the remainder of his life. Of course, there were other connections between the families that we can talk about later, but it's clear to me, and I write hopefully persuasively in the book, just how profound this relationship was to Theodore. So what did he do when he had this baby and had lost his wife and mother? He turned to what he called his feminine atlas in his life, his older sister, Bammy. Bammy took care of the young baby Alice for the better part of 3 years while Theodore fled to the West and the Badlands. She was, as always, his key political strategist. I like to say that Bammy is sort of like what Robert F. Kennedy is to John F. Kennedy. This more than strategic advisor, this trusted member of the family who sees the political chessboard in a better way than even the principal. It was actually said of Bammy, I always believed that if she had been a man, she, rather than my father, would have been president. And when asked about that quote from the daughter Alice, none other than Eleanor Roosevelt agreed. Bammy suffered a spinal defect in her youth. That's why their father, founded the orthopedic hospital, and she taught her brother how to be resilient through physical pain. Her home in Washington, D.C. at 1733 N Street was so impactful and influential that the press dubbed it the Little White House. In fact, the first cabinet meetings of Roosevelt's administration after the assassination of William McKinley took place in Bammy's home. She was so dedicated to her brother's career that she did not get married until her 40s and had her first and only child at age 42. Very, very unusual for the Victorian age and in 1897. So similar to Bammy, his younger sister Connie had this profound and unrecognized influence. She was a poet and an accomplished author. I think, again, Eleanor Roosevelt put it best when she said, if you wanted advice, you went to Bammy. If you wanted sympathy, you went to Connie. And that's indeed what Theodore did. Connie was his emotional outlet and source of empathy. They also very cleverly took advantage of the misogyny of the era. When Theodore was governor of New York, Connie would hold these breakfasts for the power brokers and the political bosses to be with Governor Roosevelt. And eventually, Boss Platt would say, all right, now everyone clear out. I want my time with the governor. And Theodore and Connie would say, well, certainly my sister ought to be able to stay. She is but a woman, and she's so interested in all the things that I do. And indeed, the boss would consent, and Connie would sit in the corner and knit quietly and hear everything they were talking about. After the boss would leave, Connie would talk with her brother about his political and personal options. So influential was Connie during the governorship in particular that Theodore himself said, haven't we had fun being governor of New York? So one sister, in the estimation of Eleanor Roosevelt, could have been president if she were a man. The other sister, by Theodore's own admission, was basically his co-governor. Which brings us back to that little girl, Edie, who had known the Roosevelts as a bonus sister, and then became the girl that everyone thought Theodore was going to engage, Edie Kermit Carew. Well, she never married, and after the death of Alice, Theodore said one thing to his sisters: under no circumstances, when I come back to New York from Dakota and the Badlands, am I to see Edith. He knew that if he did, they would instantly fall in love, and that's exactly what happened. When he came back from a trip to the Badlands, he saw Edie, and 6 weeks later, they were secretly engaged. So secretly engaged that not only did Bammy and Connie not know, but a year later, when the New York Times broke the news, Bammy actually demanded a retraction and got it. When she wrote her brother in the Badlands about this news, she said, you'll never believe this, but The damned New York Times, making things up about you again, has said that you're engaged to marry Edie Carreau. Theodore, in a pretty remarkable letter, writes back, well, that damned New York Times, always making things up about me, but this one happens to be true. I am engaged to Edith, and we are to be wed in England after the election. So the bonus sister, the person who was on the outside of the inner circle, suddenly becomes his most trusted person in life. She's really, again, so different from Alice. I don't think if you could pick two different women on the face of the earth, could you have found two more different personalities than Alice and Edith. It was said of Edith that Mrs. Roosevelt is more difficult of access. Praise does not reach or define her. She had a harder childhood. She, writes in her youth about how when the Roosevelt children come over, she's so ashamed that she has to hide her shabby toys. Her father was an alcoholic and took over the business too soon. And really, it was a managed decline of the Carreaus over the years. She was steady and really circumspect. She was a much better judge of personality than her husband. Her husband was a politician. He wanted everyone to love him, whereas Edith would really cast a more critical eye on people and the circumstances that were surrounding him. She was really known as her husband's political alter ego and emotional rudder. She, having known him since he was 3 years old, just knew how to smooth that tempestuous nature, that impulsive action, and that big personality. She actually burned much of the correspondence between she and Theodore, but thankfully her daughter did save a good portion of what they discussed. And we have a lot of information from those who witnessed their relationship in the White House and elsewhere. I could give an entire talk about the influence of Edie Carreau. And again, maybe we can talk more about her incredible time as First Lady during the Q&A. She's also I said she's the diametric opposite of Alice and Sunshine. She referred to her children as her beloved shackles. And she had this pretty remarkable phrase about her grandchildren. She said, I like to see their little faces, but I prefer to see their backs. She's quite a character, Edith. So I love, I explore this, and again, we can talk more about it if you'd like, the dynamics of these relationships. Bammy being that strategic advisor who knows who to introduce Theodore at just right time. Alice, who steers him away from science and toward politics. He says, I like to talk over everything with Alice, from politics to poetry. Connie, the sympathetic and emotional outlet, and Edie, the bonus sister who becomes the second wife and the most strategic political advisor of all. A really kind of interesting look at the loves of Theodore Roosevelt, all playing different roles in his ascendance and his success. But we can't finish a talk about Theodore Roosevelt and the loves of Theodore Roosevelt without talking about the daughter who was born on February 12th, 1884, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She was the first of the Roosevelt children born in 1884, the last to die in 1980. She knew every president from her father to Gerald Ford, and so influential was she in Washington and Washington society in particular that she was known as the Second Washington Monument. And of course, there's this famous phrase from Theodore Roosevelt. He says of Alice, I can either run the country or control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. and Alice, if you needed any proof that her mother was a dynamo and a big personality, she gave as good as she got. It is Alice who said of Theodore that he liked to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every baptism. She also had an embroidered pillow in her home that said, if you haven't got anything good to say about anyone, come and sit by me. And she is the source of those 24 love letters donated to Harvard in 1986. Fascinating. She did some interviews around the time. There was a book that was done prior to her death that accompanied the donation. Fascinating kind of look at how she saw her parents' relationship. She said that Edith never really forgave Theodore his first marriage, and said there were three people in her estimation in her parents' marriage. There was Theodore, there was her stepmother, and there was the ghost of her mother, Alice, forever 22. So I don't want to leave you tonight without talking a little bit, of course, about this incredibly historic place where you are sitting, if you're joining us in person at the TR inaugural site. Of course, this famous timeline of events, how Theodore becomes president. There's this great moment where McKinley is very resistant to the idea of Theodore becoming his vice president. Mark Hanna, in particular, the influential senator and key McKinley advisor, says, you have one duty to this country, and that is to live for another 4 years. Well, of course, that does not happen. When McKinley is visiting the Pan American Exposition in September of 1901, he is shot on September 6th. The vice president is called from a speech in Vermont, a Republican speech. He arrives in Buffalo on September 7th. It looks as though McKinley is going to recover, so he leaves and begins a vacation with his family. And then he is summoned back on September 13th when McKinley takes a turn for the worst and eventually dies in the wee hours of September 14th, 1901. And there, later that day, in the very house where you are sitting, he is inaugurated President of the United States, the youngest president in U.S. history to this day, and the 26th president of the United States. I thought maybe I'd share a little something special with you tonight from my research. So Edith Roosevelt kept these meticulous diaries, and they're very, very, very small diaries. I mean, similar to more like a calendar. And you can see here's their Excelsior diary from 1901. The opening has a bit on the eclipses and morning stars. And I was asked, how did the Roosevelts take the burden of the presidency? What was their reaction to this sudden flurry of action from September 6th to September 14th, basically a week in which he's summoned to Buffalo where he might be the president. Then the president looks like he's going to be okay. He resumes his family vacation, and suddenly he's summoned back to Buffalo, and he's the president of the United States. Well, we can look in Edith Roosevelt's diary. From September 7th, 1901, she says, Ethel and I started directly after breakfast and went to the camp. And then in the middle of this talk about what she's doing with her children, she says, we got the news of the attempted assassination of the president. Theodore telegraphed that he had to go to Buffalo instead of coming to me. And then she ends this entry, bathed in the lake, and wrote in it, which this is so Edith, if you've studied Edith. I mean, so somehow the news of the assassination, which you might think would be the lead of your diary on that day, is sandwiched in between what she had for breakfast with her daughter and that she went rowing on the lake. And then fast forward to September 14th, 1901. Now, this is, of course, the date that McKinley has died. She begins that entry that she started the day with the children. Archie is very miserable and sick, but better as the day went on. And then in the middle of this diary entry says that she received a message from Theodore that the president had died at 2:15 a.m. And then continues to talk about her children. I was tired and anxious with the children, but the children were as good as gold. Ted was happy talking to a nice girl about Alice's age, Kate Richardson, who had come down with me. I mean, it's kind of astounding, right? That somehow they just, this is the Roosevelts. They continue, they move forward, they will through it. And the center of Edith's world, the centrifugal force in her awareness was her children, even if her husband was becoming president of the United States. And one other thing that you're probably aware of, but I wanted to highlight because I think it's so extraordinary. So he becomes president in the very home you're sitting on September 14th, and then he begins to immediately dictate several letters. Well, one of the very first letters that Theodore Roosevelt dictates as president of the United States is to Booker T. Washington. And he lets him know that I write to you at once with my deep regret that my visit to the South has now to be given up. when are you coming north? I must see you as soon as possible. I want to talk over the question of possible future appointments in the South, exactly on the lines of our last conversation together. I hope that my visit to Tuskegee is merely deferred for a short time. Faithfully yours, Theodore Roosevelt. So one of the first things that Theodore Roosevelt does is dictate a letter to Booker T. Washington. There's a 30-day observance of a period of mourning for the slain president. And then on October 16th, so one day after the period of mourning is over, Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. He'll become the first Black man to dine in the White House. It will cause an extraordinary uproar. Roosevelt will never win a Southern state again in his political career. And you can see here Booker T. Washington writing and accepting the invitation for dinner on October 16th. So I just thought that was another extraordinary kind of little tidbit of history, that the first thing Theodore Roosevelt does, or one of the first things upon taking the inaugural there in the house that you're in, was to write Booker T. Washington. And then the first thing he does when the period of mourning is over is invite Booker T. To the White House. And just for a moment before we go to questions, I want to share a little bit about my day job. It was mentioned by Spencer in the introduction that I'm the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. We are under construction in Medora, North Dakota. This is a rendering of the 93-acre campus that will come to life on July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary. We have raised to date $337 million to construct this museum and this extraordinary place where we are inviting people to come and live what Theodore called the strenuous life, to come on a bike or a hike ride, to take a picnic with your family, to go and take a look at the 360-degree view from the roof of the Badlands of North Dakota, 65 million years of geologic history unfolding like a textbook. And I like to say that, you know, when you're in the East, when you're at the inaugural site, or when you're at Sagamore Hill or the boyhood home, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's ghost. But when you're in the West, when you're in the Badlands, where he recovered from depression and found the will to continue in his life, you really do feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's spirit. It's a bookend to places like you are now, the inaugural site, and we hope you'll all come visit us on July 4th, 2026 or thereafter. And on the interior of the experience, we're telling all kinds of immersive, almost theatrical stories. Here you see a rendering of the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. I mentioned when TR was a child that he lived his life through books and imagination and taxidermy. Well, in this particular room, we'll invite kids to reach into a tree trunk and see what they can explore, to open a book, and an extinct species of bird might fly out and join a wall of wonder, you know, to live through his imagination. We believe that children learn by doing, and we want this presidential library, TR's presidential library, to be a place where kids drag their parents. And again, you know, it'll be unique. It'll be the only presidential library you can hike, bike, or ride a horse to. And yes, we will have a horse hitch right outside of the museum. So with that, I want to go ahead and end with this slide of the Roosevelt family together. This is all 6 of his children, including his oldest, Alice, there in the center, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., his son in the glasses. Beside him, you have Ethel, his second and his youngest daughter, sitting at the elbow of Theodore on his lap. You have got you've got Archie, and then standing by Alice, you've got Kermit, who was thought to be Edith's favorite child, by the way, and the one that accompanied Theodore on both the African safari and the River of Doubt. And then the youngest child there on Edith's lap is Quentin. Kind of a just quick sad story with Quentin. You know, he's like John. He's a young boy growing up in the White House, in the nation's public eye and attention, and he will die in World War I, serving the nation. Theodore is the only president of the United States to have a son or daughter die in combat. He's also one of 2 fathers and sons to be awarded the Medal of Honor. So a pretty extraordinary tradition of service and sacrifice in the Roosevelts. And with that, I would love to take your questions. I'll go ahead and stop the share and perhaps there's some here in the Zoom or there at the inaugural site. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. I just wanted to, yes, please applause. Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for mentioning the Booker T. Washington connection. We participated in a bus tour that's going on all month long for Black History Month, by the way. It's called the Together as One tour, where they go to different sites around our city and talk about the Black history that took place here in Buffalo. We participated in we were actually the first stop of the month. So February 1st, we had a busload of visitors come to our site where we talked about the Booker T. Washington letter that was written here in this house. We actually do have copies of that you can see when you come on tour. And we also have the desk of Ansley Wilcox, which was likely the desk that Roosevelt used when he was what we like to call in office here in this temporary White House. I also wanted to thank you for mentioning Eleanor as you went along. I think a lot of people forget about Eleanor. I'm an Eleanor enthusiast, and that relationship between niece and uncle is so interesting to me. One of my favorite stories is St. Patrick's Day, about how Franklin and Eleanor were married on St. Patrick's Day because it was the only day that they could get Theodore to New York City to walk her down the aisle because her father had already passed by then. And Roosevelt was actually in the St. Patrick's Day parade that day. So he was able to walk Eleanor down the aisle, and that is why they were married on St. Patrick's Day. So it's just an interesting relationship there. I'm going to start with our in-person.
And then Spencer, I can't resist saying, and then, Theodore slapped FDR on the back and said, "Good to keep the name in the family, Franklin."
I think about how they would have to monogram towels and sheets back then. What an easy job that was for her as a young
Roosevelt.
Let's start with our in-person audience. Opening up for questions, comments.
Hi. Hi, how are you? My name is Kevin Walter. You mentioned that it wasn't apparently not true that Theodore would not talk about Alice anymore, his first wife. You mentioned that big bump of hair that you found. What other, were there other, I got the sense that you kind of came upon other evidence that she remained a larger factor in his life than we think.
Yes. Well, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. For those on the Zoom asking about additional evidence that Theodore did not expunge Alice from his memory and life. So there's a couple of things I explore in the book. And first and foremost, of course, he has the living example of his daughter. And his daughter would vacation summer every summer of her life, basically with the Lees. And so there was a voluminous correspondence between the Lee family and the Roosevelts to coordinate the movements of Alice, especially when she was fairly young. Edith also kept meticulous records of the family finances. If you know and have read about Theodore in other ways, so he was terrible with money. She would pin $20 to his suit, and he would come back and have absolutely no idea where it went. At Sagamore Hill, the records are excruciatingly precise of every dime that was spent on every child. And oftentimes, next to an entry for Alice, it'll actually say Lee money. So there was a bit of a tension in the family, actually, because Alice was subsidized, if you will, by her grandparents. The Carolyn Haskell Lee and her grandfather would provide for her in any way that she needed, often above and beyond what the Roosevelt family could afford, because he was, constantly in public service, and they were thinking about selling Sagamore Hill, or his income primarily came through books and articles and magazines. So there's the financial support. There's also very specific incidents like the wedding. When Alice was married in the White House, they invited the Lees to come. Several members of the Lee family were there. Unfortunately, there's no record of the walk, but Theodore took a walk with his former father-in-law around the White House grounds before the wedding began. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. I mean, can you imagine the swell of emotion that the parents would have on the day of their granddaughter's wedding at the White House, thinking that their daughter, was married to the future president of the United States and died at 22. So there's some emotional leaps and moments like that, but there's some physical evidence in the hair, the ledgers, the finances, and the correspondence. I mean, they wrote each other quite often and would make reference. And there's some additional kind of auxiliary. If you're familiar with Theodore's time in the West, he gets to know a dynamic woman named Patty Selms, and there's a record of Patty's and Isabella Greenway at the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson, and it's a bit of an unexplored treasure trove. There's a lot of letters between Theodore and Patty throughout the rest of their lives, in which she loses her husband, and Theodore shares with her the pain of losing a spouse in a way that he really doesn't share with anybody else. So the feelings are there. I mean, he sublimated them very maybe effectively, I guess you could say. But there's no doubt that Alice was in his mind and is in his thoughts and in the physical form of his daughter.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Ed, I don't know if you had a chance to check out the watch at Sagamore Hill. I don't know when you were recently there. For those in the audience, you might be familiar with the story of Theodore Roosevelt's pocket watch. If you have not familiarized yourself with that story, go down a Google hole later, because it was all over the national media in June of last year. Theodore Roosevelt's personal pocket watch was actually on display here at the TR site in the 1970s and 80s, and it was stolen from here, and it disappeared. And we never found out who took it, why, where it went. In February, I'm also noticing in all the pictures and all the trend, February seems to be the month where things are happening in Roosevelt's life. And it's very interesting. But in February of 2023, the TR site was contacted by an auction house in Florida asking, one, if we wanted to bid on this pocket watch that may have belonged to Theodore Roosevelt, and two, if we had any documentation or anything that could basically prove what it was. So our dedicated team here, Amy Sanderson, our collections manager, who may or may not be on the call, but I want to give her a shout out. She was able to pull the documentation from decades before that proved that this was in fact the same pocket watch that was on Roosevelt's person a great portion of his life. What was interesting about the pocket watch, though, was that it was silver, and which was more of a cheaper metal for that time period and for a family of this means. It wasn't gold, it wasn't any other metal, but it was silver. And it was monogrammed with Connie's initials and her husband's initials, and Roosevelt's initials. And it was a gift from her and her husband to Roosevelt, which he cherished. But in all the conversations with Sagamore Hill, we believed, and this is a couple other people at Sagamore Hill, the belief is that he was gifted a silver pocket watch because she knew he would damage it. And she knew that it would get lost somewhere, or it would get bent, and it was. I mean, it definitely got broken up, and he definitely got it up and running again. But it had been missing for 30 years and then found. And then last June, we were able to return it to Sagamore Hill, its true home, and where it is now forever. And we'll never go on loan ever again. But I just thought it was so interesting. It was such an interesting look into that family and to look into his relationship with his sisters just through a pocket watch, that they knew him. And they knew him to the point where they knew that silver was probably the way to go because it would get lost in Panama or banged up in Cuba, all these things. So it was great. Who has a question here in the room? Here we go. I was waiting for you.
Hi, Ed. My name is Terry Bourgeois. I'm also a fellow North Dakotan. My family's still living there. My mom is 90 years old in Bismarck, and my sister is a senator for the state legislature there. So I can tell you also that I've lived in Western New York here for 26 years in the city of good neighbors, and it's my favorite place outside of North Dakota. And you should spend more time here than just hotel in during COVID, so. Coming up to New York, it's a great place to go. And also, I would also say that, for those in the audience here, locally, online, that the work that Ed is doing at the Presidential Library, extending Theodore Roosevelt's legacy far into the future as a resource for future leaders of the world, is really, truly remarkable work. So thank you for what you're doing, Ed. And if you get a chance to go there, after July of 2026, the musical in Medora is outstanding. And if you ever want to feel patriotic, go to the musical in Medora. It's absolutely outstanding. So I do have a question about what is the family discussion like when Theodore Roosevelt, as Secretary of the Navy, is pushing to get a commission in the Army, wants to go to Cuba and fight. What is that conversation like with Edith, he was married to at the time, or what were the women saying about this quest that he wanted to go on in Cuba?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you very much for that kind compliment about the work of the TR Library. I hope Spencer might occasionally reconsider the loan policy, because we do have humidity controls and security controls and all kinds of ways that we can guard these special artifacts. They will not leave the cases. But no, we hope you do all come visit us after July 4th, 2026 or thereafter. And that's a great question. I mean, I write a lot about this in the book because, of course, it is Theodore's crowded hour, but it was absolutely insane. I mean, he was asked twice by the president, McKinley, his future running mate, not to resign his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And many of his contemporaries, I mean, there are letter after letter. Henry Adams, the descendant of both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, a kind of raconteur of Washington at the time, says, well, surely that's it. He's gone mad. I mean, his political career is over. The women, it's a fascinating mix of reactions. Very importantly, Edith was pregnant with Quentin and had a very difficult childbirth that they feared might kill her. And obviously that echoes the experience with Alice. And she requires a surgery not about 6 months or so after his birth, but she's quite sick. I mean, she is thought to be perhaps on her deathbed. And later, after he's survived the war, Theodore will look back and say, I would have left my wife's deathbed to take part in the war in Cuba. That's all a little bit revisionist. He survived, she survived. He can be bold about it now that it's over, but it's an agonizing 6 months in which he's really, truly trying to think through his desire to go and to prove his mettle in battle, to make potentially the ultimate sacrifice of his life if necessary. And his wife is sick, and at first she really doesn't want him to go. And there's a wonderful biographer, Stacy Cordery, who perhaps has visited the TR inaugural. She wrote the 1-volume biography of Alice, the daughter. And she wrote a great article for the Theodore Roosevelt Association, the TRA journal that I cite in the book, where she, and I agree, that Edith made the trip to San Antonio specifically to say to Theodore, I'm okay with this. That I want you to go, and I understand you have to go. And her presence there was not only consenting to his going to war, understanding why he needed to. I think his sisters understood that need a little bit more. Connie basically acted as his pseudo press secretary before the role existed. She would slip stories of his heroics to the press. She would take letters that were to the family and actually make sure they got into the hands of reporters. It was actually Bammy who identified Richard Harding Davis, the primary reporter that made TR famous. It was Bammy who introduced him to TR when he was police commissioner. So in a strange way, you can connect each of the women to that heroic moment without them, without Edith really consenting to him to go, without Bammy, making that strategic introduction to a reporter that makes him famous, and without Connie, who's feeding the stories over Edith's objections. By the way, she does not appreciate that Connie is slipping stories to the press. He probably doesn't become the hero that he became, and then of course the governor, vice president, and president.
I think it's safe to say that we couldn't have a TR had it not been for his sisters, at least the rest of the women in his family. Pat, questions in the chat. You want to read one aloud for us?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're all good.
All right. Well, the first comment we have is super lovely. And I, again, echoing, I think everybody's feeling, Ed, is truly outstanding presentation, and she cannot wait to read your book. So you have a new fan coming on board there. Wonderful. And then we have another one, and let me read that. Okay. Speaking of the library and potential well-secured exhibits, do you see any of the stories, themes, or discoveries from your book influencing future exhibits or programming at the library? It seems like a great opportunity to highlight such an important but somewhat overlooked aspect of TR's life.
Well, thank you for that question, Pat and Marcy. Yes, absolutely. When I started my research for what became The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I actually first hoped to write about TR's time in the West. That I would write about. I'm from North Dakota. I grew up in North Dakota. I would travel out west to the Badlands and Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and as I said before, when you're there, it is almost a spiritual place. I mean, every time I go there now in my new role, you'll run into somebody who's lost somebody in their family to cancer, or is going through a divorce or a tough time in their life, and they've come there like TR did to be with nature and to feel a sense of recovery and resilience. And I think that the stories of the women in his life that made that possible, both the women that he lost, Alice, and the woman that he rediscovered, Edith, and the women, of course, in the form of his mother and his two sisters. What that story said to me is it's not the TR that I knew, right? I mean, most of the TR stories that I heard were of this almost superhuman, very masculine guy who somehow, you almost feel a little inadequate, right? If you want to feel bad about yourself, compare yourself to TR. 42 books, more letters than Jefferson, first American to win the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, and it goes on and on and on. And sometimes it feels a little unattainable. But what I found in getting to know the women in his life better is that, it's a much more universal story. If we're fortunate in our lives, you've got a brother or a sister or a spouse or a boss, somebody who picks you up and pushes you forward when you're at your most vulnerable or down. And Theodore Roosevelt had that. He had a family that cared about him so deeply that they refused to let him do anything but succeed. And I thought that that's a story that needs to be told. And I think that's a story that we're hoping to tell in the library, because again, building a presidential library to Theodore Roosevelt over 100 years after his death is not for Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, he, of course, is a great example that we all want to live up to. But if you want to learn about TR, you can go to the inaugural site in Buffalo. You can go to Sagamore Hill. You can go to the Boyhood Home. I think that, we want to encourage people to go to all those places and see the real thing and the real place where it happened. But we also want them to come to the Badlands in North Dakota to think about their own lives and how TR's example can inspire them to get in the arena and be the change that they want to see in the world. I think it's actually, I think, the advantage of building this institution 100 years later. We know what stories and examples endure from his life, and we can, instead of trying to write the first draft of history, we can look back and look to the past to understand the present and hopefully make a better future by inspiring people with this incredible life and all the people in it. And you're from Bismarck, so you can go very often. I love that.
Pat, do we have any other questions in the chat?
Not that I'm seeing right now, Spencer.
Hey, how about in the room here in person? Okay, I see the hand. Coming to you.
Hi, my name is Ellen Bean, and I have a small question. What took Mitty's family to Georgia?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So she was born in Connecticut, but most of the family was in Georgia. There's a history of the family. In fact, that's part of the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara. I mentioned that Margaret Mitchell, in an interview in the 1920s, talks a bit about that. But it was basically marriage and economic opportunity. Most of the family lived in Georgia. They happened to be in Connecticut, and in those days, you would go where your family was, and basically there was a time period where before the birth, that's where you would stay. So she was technically born in the North, but the family lived in the South, and she simply returned there after the baby was born. But since you opened the door to the Bullocks, I mean, the Bullocks are just this crazy family worthy of their own chapters in a book sometime. Her brothers were so dastardly in their deeds, as I mentioned, that they were excommunicated from the general clemency by the United States government. One of her brothers was actually involved in breaking the blockade. He was one of the key figures in the Confederate Navy and instrumental in getting goods and supplies that were unavailable in the South. They had ample cotton, but they didn't have a lot of the industrial materials that the North had. So they relied on shipments from Britain, from the UK, and he was very involved in that, particularly with the USS Alabama, one of the most deadly parts of the Confederate Navy. And then her other brother was actually thought to potentially be involved in the finances surrounding Lincoln's assassination. So that would be a good reason to get yourself excommunicated from the general amnesty. A very Southern family. I mean, I think the other thing that's really interesting is she moves back north. I mean, she's born in Connecticut. She lives in the South most of her adolescence. She moves to the North, and Theodore and his sisters and his brother grow up in a house divided in a nation divided. They see their parents disagree without being disagreeable on one of the most contentious issues in American history. And I really think there's something to that. I think, he sees that, and his sisters see that. And there's a lot of kind of not only patriotism and feeling of pride in service, but also a recognition of civic disagreement and putting family, maintaining the family through difficult times. And I think that's another kind of interesting example that they witnessed, despite her northern roots and her southern roots.
Yes, I see another hand.
Hi, who is the Longworth that his daughter married?
Yes, well, that's a great question. The Longworth that Alice married was the Speaker of the House. So imagine that, if the President of the United States' daughter married the Speaker of the House. That would create quite a stir. And she was, of course, known as Princess Alice, and really kind of a dynamic figure in the press. Nicholas and Alice did not have the best relationship. It was very, very strained at times in their marriage. I mentioned Stacey Corderay's really great single volume biography about Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Totally worth a read if you haven't had a chance to absorb that one. And they had a big falling out around the 1912 election. He was a congressman from Ohio, for whom the Longworth building is named, one of the House office buildings to this day. And he's running as a Republican. Of course, her father runs as a Republican, loses the Republican nomination, even though he probably won the number of votes requisite to get it, and runs as a third-party independent bull moose, a progressive. And that causes huge strain in her marriage when she basically sides with her father and says, I'm going to help him. And that's a really interesting moment of reunification for Alice and Theodore. They work together on a number of his most important speeches, including a big speech that he gives at Madison Square Garden after the failed assassination attempt. And later it is revealed that the only daughter that was born to Nicholas and Alice was not actually his. It was born out of an affair with a senator. So she's colorful in many ways.
Oh, this night got a little juicy. Okay.
We got a little juicy.
How long did Theodore stay here after the inauguration? And did Edith have to pack up the kids and head back to Washington?
Yeah, well, she never made the trip to Buffalo. She stayed with the kids in New York and then repositioned to Sagamore in order to bring them down for what would become their first nights in the White House. He only stayed 2 days. He wasn't there too long before he then made his way back to his family. And then they actually, the first night he was in the White House was September 24th, which happened to be his father's birthday. And so there's this remarkable scene where he's got his, Edith had not yet come down with the children. She was still trying to get them organized. And again, they summered in Sagamore Hill, and he was the vice president. So he did have a home in Washington. So it wasn't an enormous change in their life, but he had gone from, he'd been a civil service commissioner in Washington, D.C. Then he was police commissioner in New York. Then he was assistant secretary of the Navy in D.C. And then, governor in New York, and then back down to DC as vice president. So Edith had done that move. I think she moved them from New York to Washington 5 times in a decade, which is pretty extraordinary to think about, given that it's the 1890s. So he has his first night in the White House on September 24th, and only his sisters are able to join him. And there's a Sophronia rose that has been picked from the gardens around the White House. They didn't yet establish the Rose Garden. That would actually start with Edith, who built the Colonial Garden that then became the Rose Garden. But there were Sophronia roses, which they remark is the rose that their father most commonly had as his lapel rose. So there's kind of this poignant moment where Theodore is in the White House for the first time with his sisters. And again, remember that letter from December 31st, 1861. Poor William McKinley, never stand in front of a man of destiny.
That was a good question. Thank you for that question. We recently accessioned a photographed postcard into our collection here at the TR site of a brownstone, and it is believed that it is an image of Bammy's house in Washington, D.C., where Roosevelt took up residence as he gave Ida McKinley time to move out, which is that transition of power. And thank you for asking about the time frame when he was here. Like in 2024, it was very similar to 1901 in that September 14th fell on a Saturday. So Roosevelt was alerted on Friday, September 13th. So another Friday the 13th. There were a number of commemorations that took place in Buffalo following the death of McKinley. As you can imagine, that weekend was jam-packed. Roosevelt actually worshipped at First Presbyterian Church on Symphony Circle when he was here. So we're actually looking at some programming we can do with them. 2026, in addition to America 250, will also be the 125th anniversary of the unexpected inauguration in Buffalo. So we are actually looking at a number of different programs and events that we can collaborate with other institutions like the Presidential Library and bring the history back to Buffalo from that 1901 event. So thank you for bringing that up. It was the funeral train disembarked from Buffalo, I believe, on that Monday, carrying McKinley's body and Mrs. McKinley. That really took the Washington people back to Washington. So we were kind of the center of the world for 2 days here. I saw him back here again.
And I love, Spencer, that, you know, I mentioned Mark Hanna, Senator Mark Hanna, who was so he admonished McKinley that his one duty to the country was to live for the next 4 years. Of course, when he heard the news, there's the famous quote. He said, "Now that damned cowboy is president of the United States."
Hello. I don't know if a woman in his life had any influence in this, but I wonder, can you tell us about how TR started calling the executive mansion the White House and how it became the official name for the building?
It was a woman. It was Edith. So Bammy had introduced McKim, Mead, and White to Edith and suggested that if they were going to engage in renovations of the White House, which were sorely needed, they should use McKim, Mead, and White. And that's indeed what happened. And in answer to your specific question, the house had been nicknamed the White House and sometimes referred to as the White House because it's actually a brick that's painted white, and it was the Roosevelt's. You noticed, I think, on the Booker T. Washington, they refer to Executive Mansion. They actually changed the stationery. They said, you know, we're not going to use this formal name that doesn't seem accessible. We should use the nickname. The nickname is much more welcoming and open and more democratic in a way. And so changing the stationery and the letterhead was what began to change the references to the White House. The renovation, however, was really, really significant. You know, Edith oversaw what would become the East Wing and the West Wing. That's primarily because she said, you know, I have 6 children, 3 of whom are still living with her, including a pretty young child, Quentin, and she needed a residence. I mean, she needed a place where the actual work of the executive office of a branch of government would take place and where the family would live. I say in the book, she was in the room where it happened because she designed it that way. She put her office next to the president's in the residence, which remains to this day. She planted the Colonial Garden, which became the Rose Garden eventually. She held the first salons and gatherings of musicians and artists in the White House, something that Jacqueline Kennedy will then later copy during the Kennedy administration. She brings the first portraits of first ladies into the White House. She collects china from all the previous presidents where possible and begins the White House China collection. She hires the first social secretary. She's the first lady to have a social secretary. Every first lady subsequent has had one, but it was revolutionary at the time. They hosted, so there's that 30-day period of mourning, and Spencer referenced the funeral train, which he knows far more about than me, but immediately after that 30-day period of mourning is over, they begin hosting, starts with Booker T. Washington, but continues with 40,000 guests to the White House in the first year of the Roosevelt administration, which was a pretty strong contrast to the McKinley administration. I mean, you know, it was rambunctious, and the kids and the guests, and that all revolved around Edith. And the physical changes she made to the White House are really what made it the function of the executive branch of the government, in addition to a residence for her family.
We have time for one more question.
Mhm.
Anyone? Okay, Terry, since you're from North Dakota, you can wrap up your question.
Something you just said made me think about Sagamore Hill and the way Edith's room was right across from where. Is there a similarity between Sagamore Hill design and what she did in the White House?
That's a very astute observation. Yes, there absolutely is. They were extraordinarily close. I mean, they knew each other. Edith knew Theodore for 57 of his 60 years of life. I mean, they were married for 31 years. It's a pretty extraordinary relationship that can span from childhood to death. And she'll outlive him by an additional 30 years, which is also pretty remarkable to think about. She read 4 or 5 newspapers a day and would report what she read to Theodore. She was his strategic advisor on basically all appointments. I mean, I mentioned that she was a better judge of character than TR. It's hard. She was the first person that he talked to in the morning, the last person he talked to at night. Henry Stimson, who will go on to serve multiple administrations and probably most famously or infamously, he is the Secretary of War who makes the decision on what cities we will drop the atomic bomb on during FDR's administration. And though there's some historical speculation and argument about this, and this is far from my area of expertise, but it was thought that he struck Kyoto in Japan from the list because that's where he honeymooned with his wife and didn't want to see it destroyed. Henry Stimson actually is one of the secondary sources we have that observed the relationship between Theodore and Edith in the White House and said for a fact that when Theodore went against her judgment, he regretted it. That basically every good, sound decision he made, he ran by his wife first. That's a pretty extraordinary statement from Henry. That's a pretty good source of their relationship. So yes, that proximity of his office directly across the hall from Edith's room in Sagamore, which is, it's Edith's room because it's the only one that doesn't have taxidermy all over it. It's exactly like the setup in the White House. She's right next door to his private office, and they can consult on everything.
It's amazing. When I was at Sagamore Hill this summer, there's a bright blue and pink room, and then there's the man cave. So very obvious to pick out who was in what domain in that house. I spent some time talking to Tweed Roosevelt while I was there, and he remembers Edith. And I can't remember if he's grandson or great grandson, but he remembers Edith, and he used to spend the night at the house. And he used to sneak out, and he could pinpoint which window was hers, and he would sneak out of the window onto the porch. Apparently, generations of Roosevelts before him had already done the same thing. But she was pretty astute and knew when the kids were sneaking in and out of their bedroom windows too. So thank you, Ed. I just thank everyone in the audience. Thank everyone on our virtual audience for coming this evening and participating in tonight's talk. I'm not going to let you go just yet. Upcoming for the TR site, we have 5 traveling exhibits who will be visiting here this year, starting in March with an exhibit focused on the history of immigration in New York State, which is perfect timing for our next speaker night on March 25th, where we will hear from Ed Patton and the Irish Genealogical Society of Buffalo, who will be talking about the Irish and other ethnic groups and their immigration in Buffalo and Western New York. That again is March 25th, right in time for St. Patrick's Day. Also coming up in April, going back to what Pat was doing out west, April 22nd, another speaker night. We will be having our guest speaker, Dwayne Junt, who is a historian and a TRA advisory board member. He will be leading a presentation called Birdwatcher in Chief, Teddy Roosevelt and America's Birds. So if we want to keep the TR theme going, please come back in March and April. So with that, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Ed. Thank you to Pat. And please, for those in person, enjoy the goodies. Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Ed.